Right, in this video I'm going to show you how to draw an animal cell. Again, it's a good way to remember all the structures that go into animal cells and what they do if you practice drawing them, and then thinking through as you draw what each structure or organelle does. Animal cells themselves don't have cell walls. You don't see a cell wall on an animal cell. So the only thing that separates the inside and the outside of an animal cell is the cell membrane. Again, it's a very, very thin structure. Under the microscope, you very seldom see them. You'll sometimes see the cell membrane because it's a very active area of an animal cell, particularly in cells that secrete stuff. You'll see that there's stuff piled up against the edge of the cell membrane. What you're seeing is that stuff stained, not the cell membrane itself. Anyway, we can go for our lives with an animal cell. Let's take a free living animal cell as an example. And we'll just do a nice big kind of fried egg shape, if you like. That's okay. Now, I like to think about a fried egg because essentially what you see in an animal cell is the egg white, which is the cytoplasm, and the egg yolk, which is the nucleus. So if you look at any animal cell under the microscope and you stain it with the right stains, that's generally what you see. You see very little else under the light microscope. Under the electron microscope, you'll see other structures, but under the light microscope, you'll see the cytoplasm, which is inside the cell membrane. So what have we got here? We've got our cell membrane. And remember, you'll find this labeled the plasma membrane in a number of other sources. You look at other videos, you look at textbooks and things, they'll call this the plasma membrane quite often. I like to call it the cell membrane because this really reminds me that it's the membrane that goes on the outside of the cell. Animal cells are complex cells. They are eukaryotic cells. They have membrane-bound structures within them. And so plasma membrane is used inside the cell to make things like endoplasmic reticulum, to make things like the nuclear cell membrane, the nuclear membrane inside the cell, to surround the mitochondria, that kind of stuff. We don't need to worry about that just now with National 5 biology, so we'll call that the cell membrane. And we'll remember that the cell membrane controls what passes in and out of the cell. So the substances inside the cell are different to the substances outside the cell. Inside the cell we have a liquid, an aqueous solution, a watery solution that's usually a bit thicker than the outside, but if the outside is seawater it might be a little bit thinner, if you like, less salt. But that area in there, we'll just use a circle to represent a dot here to represent it's the whole area. We're going to call that the cytoplasm. And that is the solution in which all the reactions of the cell take place. Now, inside the animal cell, as I said, the one thing you see is the cytoplasm, which if you stain it with H&E stain, it will look a kind of pinkish colour. For the eosin stain. The other thing you'll see in the light microscope when you look down it is you'll see the nucleus. The nucleus will tend to be a relatively round structure, and with H&E staining it will stain a kind of dark purpley blue. So quite often when we look at cells under the microscope, they've been stained using this staining method. Now the nucleus contains the DNA of the cell. And animal cells tend to be very active. Remember, an animal cell doesn't make its own food. So at the very least, it is constantly importing sugar as a food source, glucose, and it is constantly exporting all the waste products of its respiration. So animal cells tend to be quite active. They tend to have quite active nuclei. But this is what we call, this is the nucleus. All right. So, nucleus controls the cell. It sends out plans to the rest of the cell to tell it which proteins to make. Not every cell makes every protein that is contained in the DNA. You probably can figure this out for yourself if you think that every single cell in your body contains the same DNA, but that each cell is different. A skin cell makes different proteins to a brain cell, for example, and that's controlled by the DNA inside the nucleus. Now, there's not really much else we can see in a light microscope apart from we can't see the cell membrane, but what we can see is the limits of the cell, usually stained up by the eosine stain. The eosine stain can be a kind of orangey pink color, and that cytoplasm will stain orangey pink. I'm just putting it in very lightly here, so you won't even see that probably. Very, very lightly stained inside. So what do animal cells have that we have to remember? Well, inside each of the animal cells, I'm going to use a green dot, I think, for this. We have tiny little structures. That's probably not a good idea, actually, using green dots, because you might confuse it with chloroplasts. But anyway, around the nucleus, we'll have these tiny little structures, and these are the ribosomes. Now, what the ribosomes do is they take the instructions from the nucleus and make the proteins that the cell needs. You can't make the proteins in the nucleus because they wouldn't be able to get out of the nucleus. So you have to make them out in the cytoplasm because that's where the action is. The action of the cell is in the cytoplasm. That's where the animal cell does stuff. The nucleus contains all the plans. All right. Apart from that, what animal cells need? They need energy. Energy comes in the form of glucose, which is a big sugar molecule. Glucose contains far more energy than is required for each reaction inside a cell. You can think of it like a multiple pack of batteries from the supermarket. You can buy 38 batteries in a packet with glucose. And what happens in the cell is that has to be broken up to individual batteries so that each little process that's going on inside the cell has its own battery. Now, the thing that breaks up the battery pack, the glucose molecule, is the mitochondrion. I'm just going to draw a mitochondrion a little bit more complicated than we did for the plant cell. You'll see it normally represented as a structure with a kind of extra membrane inside. It's a double membrane structure, and it carries out cellular respiration. Okay, so the mitochondrion converts the glucose from the big glucose molecule into ATP, and you get about 38 ATP molecules out of one glucose molecule, and each ATP molecule is used to run a cellular process. If you have a cell that is manufacturing stuff, you'll tend to see lots of little vesicles, and they will be exporting stuff out of the cell. I can never remember whether it's one S or two S's for vesicles. I have a feeling it's one. So check that one before you write it down yourselves. And sometimes you'll see larger structures in something like an amoeba. You might see a vacuole. But again, it's a membranous structure that separates something inside the cell. It packages something up inside a little bit of plasma membrane. And these vacuoles could be for digesting things or for storing water or whatever. They'll be called vacuoles or vesicles, or sometimes they have particular names like lysosomes, that kind of stuff. But that's all a little bit more complicated than we need to know for National 5. So there you go. There's your animal cell. Not much to it. Remember, in order to tell an animal cell from pretty much all the other cells you're going to encounter, is it won't have a cell wall. It'll just have a cell membrane, a nucleus, mitochondria, maybe a few vesicles, some ribosomes, and a vacuole. That's all you're going to see in your animal cells. If it's got a cell wall, if they've got a double line around here representing something thick, or a thick line representing something thick around your cell, it's not an animal cell. Animal cells do not have cell walls. All right? That's it. Piece of cake, drawing an animal cell. Next lesson we'll look at drawing a fungal cell.